They fired me on a Wednesday, 30 minutes before I was supposed to present the compliance framework that would save the company $90 million. I remember watching my boss's face as he slid the termination letter across the conference table and thinking, this man has no idea what he's just done. But let me start from the beginning. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 12 years, I was the Director of Regulatory Compliance at Vanguard Tech Solutions, a mid-sized government contractor specializing in cybersecurity infrastructure. If that sounds boring, you're right. It was boring. Tediously, meticulously, beautifully boring. And that's exactly why I was good at it. In the world of government contracts, compliance isn't just important, it's survival. One failed audit, one missed regulation, one incorrectly documented process, and you lose everything. Your contracts get terminated. Your reputation gets destroyed. Your company becomes a cautionary tale in industry conferences. I'd built our compliance department from the ground up. When I started, Vanguard had 3 government contracts worth maybe $8 million combined. By year 12, we had 17 contracts totaling $90 million annually. Every single one of them passed audit. Every single time. My secret wasn't complicated. I was obsessive. I documented everything. I created systems within systems, backups for backups, verification protocols that made people groan but kept us bulletproof. My team called me the machine behind my back. I wore it as a badge of honor. The office itself was standard corporate, open floor plan that management insisted promoted collaboration, but really just meant everyone could hear everyone else's conversations. My desk was strategically positioned near the compliance archives, a temperature-controlled room filled with filing cabinets that held 12 years of perfectly organized documentation. My team was small but loyal. There was Marcus, my deputy director, who'd been with me for 8 years. He understood the systems almost as well as I did. Almost. Then there was Jennifer and Tom, both senior compliance analysts who could navigate federal regulations in their sleep. And finally, there was Lisa, our newest hire, who joined 6 months ago and showed real promise. Everything changed when Gerald Hawkins became our new COO. Gerald was a visionary. That's what the board called him when they brought him in from a Silicon Valley startup that had recently gone public. He wore expensive sneakers to board meetings, talked about disruption and agile methodology, and had absolutely no patience for what he called legacy thinking, which I quickly learned meant compliance. Our first meeting was a disaster. He'd called together all department heads to discuss operational efficiency. When my turn came to present, I explained our compliance framework, the documentation protocols, the audit schedules, the verification systems. Gerald interrupted me halfway through. This seems incredibly bureaucratic. How much time does your team spend on actual work versus paperwork? The paperwork is the work, I explained carefully. Government audits require. I understand audits, he said, smiling that patronizing smile I'd come to hate. But at my last company, we automated most of this. Cut compliance costs by 40%. Were you handling classified government contracts with security clearance requirements? His smile tightened. I'm just saying there's room for innovation here, Sarah. Let's think outside the box. I should have seen the warning signs. But I was arrogant. I thought my track record spoke for itself. 12 years, 17 contracts, 0 failed audits. I thought I was untouchable. I was wrong. Over the next 6 months, Gerald began systematically undermining my department. He hired an external consultant, some 28-year-old with an MBA and a TED Talk, to assess operational redundancies. The consultant's report recommended cutting my team by half and implementing a streamlined digital compliance platform. I fought back. I presented data showing that our current system had a perfect success rate. I explained that government audits weren't like private sector reviews. They were comprehensive, adversarial, and unforgiving. I warned that cutting corners would be catastrophic. Gerald smiled and told me I was being resistant to change. Then came the announcement that crushed my team's morale. Vanguard had won the biggest contract in company history, a 5-year, $90 million deal with the Department of Defense to provide cybersecurity infrastructure for military installations. It was a career-defining win, but there was a catch. The contract required passing a Level 4 defense contract audit agency review within 90 days of signing. Level 4 audits are notoriously brutal. They examine everything: financial systems, personnel security, supply chain integrity, technical specifications, documentation practices. The failure rate for first-time Level 4 audits is around 70%. I'd been preparing for this moment my entire career. I immediately began building the audit framework, a comprehensive system that would guide us through every requirement, every checkpoint, every potential pitfall. I worked 70-hour weeks. My team did the same. We created documentation matrices, verification protocols, cross-reference systems that would prove every claim we made. But Gerald had other plans. 2 weeks before the audit, he announced that Lisa, our newest, least experienced analyst, would be taking over as interim compliance director. I'd be transitioning to an advisory role to bring fresh perspective to the audit process. I couldn't believe it. Lisa's been here 6 months. She doesn't know the systems. She doesn't have the institutional knowledge. She has new ideas, Gerald interrupted. And frankly, Sarah, your approach is outdated. We need someone who understands modern compliance frameworks. Modern frameworks don't work for Level 4 audits. You need documentation, verification, institutional memory. This isn't a discussion, he said coldly. You'll train Lisa over the next 2 weeks, then step back. I trained her. What choice did I have? But I could see the panic in her eyes as I walked her through systems that had taken me 12 years to build. She was smart, capable, but she was drowning. You can't learn 12 years of institutional knowledge in 2 weeks. Then, 1 week before the audit, I made a critical mistake. I discovered discrepancies in the financial documentation Gerald had submitted as part of the contract bid. Small things, dates that didn't quite match, expenses that seemed inflated, subcontractor relationships that weren't properly disclosed. Nothing overtly illegal, but enough to raise serious questions during an audit. I documented everything and requested a meeting with Gerald and our CFO. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the company. Instead, Gerald accused me of sabotaging the transition. He said I was manufacturing problems to make Lisa look bad. He said I was bitter about being replaced and trying to undermine the company's biggest contract. You're fired, Sarah, he said, his voice flat. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. And that's how I ended up in a conference room on a Wednesday morning, 30 minutes before I was supposed to present the compliance framework that would save a $90 million contract, being handed a termination letter and a box for my desk belongings. Marcus found me at the elevator. This is insane, he whispered. The audit is next week. Lisa can't, I know, I said quietly. Security guard was already approaching. But there's nothing I can do. His face was pale. Sarah, the documentation systems. The verification protocols. I know the basics, but the deep architecture, the cross-references, the backup systems, I looked at him, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Then I guess you'll figure it out. I walked out of Vanguard Tech Solutions with my box of desk belongings and 12 years of institutional knowledge that no one else fully possessed. And despite everything, I felt a strange, dark satisfaction, because they had no idea what they'd just lost. The first 3 days after termination, I stayed in my apartment and did nothing. I watched television I didn't care about. I ate cereal for dinner. I ignored calls from former colleagues and stared at my ceiling at 3 in the morning, replaying the moment Gerald handed me that termination letter. On day 4, Marcus called. I almost didn't answer. Sarah, we're drowning, he said without preamble. The audit is in 4 days. Lisa is having panic attacks. Gerald keeps insisting we're fine, but we're not fine. Half the documentation is incomplete. The verification protocols you built, we thought we understood them, but there are layers we didn't know existed. I'm sorry, Marcus, I said carefully. I can't help. I was terminated. I know, but I was escorted out by security. I signed an NDA. If I provide any assistance to the company post-termination, I could be sued for breach of confidentiality and non-compete violations. There was a long pause. Gerald didn't think this through, did he? No, I said. He didn't. Marcus hung up. I stared at my phone and felt that cold satisfaction grow stronger. Over the next 2 days, my phone exploded. Jennifer called, begging for help. Tom sent desperate emails asking for clarification on specific protocols. Even Lisa called, crying, saying she didn't know what she was doing and the whole thing was going to collapse. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I was cruel, but because I legally couldn't. Gerald had made sure of that. Then, the day before the audit, my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered. Ms. Mitchell? This is Robert Chin, General Counsel for Vanguard Tech Solutions. We need to meet. Immediately. The coffee shop he suggested was downtown, neutral territory. Robert was younger than I expected, mid-40s, with the exhausted look of someone who'd been putting out fires all night. I'll be direct, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. The audit is tomorrow. Our compliance team has informed me that significant portions of the documentation framework are incomplete or inaccessible. Gerald Hawkins has insisted they're prepared, but my conversations with the team suggest otherwise. I sipped my coffee and said nothing. MS. Mitchell, I've reviewed your termination. While it was technically legal, the timing is problematic. We're facing a Level 4 DCA audit worth $90 million, and we just fired the person who built our entire compliance infrastructure. That does seem short-sighted, I agreed. Robert leaned forward. We need your help. We're willing to offer a consulting contract, generous hourly rate, limited scope, just enough to get us through the audit. I set down my coffee. Mr. Chin, I appreciate the offer. But I signed a termination agreement. I also signed an NDA and a non-compete clause. If I provide any assistance to Vanguard, Gerald could sue me personally for breach of contract. Gerald won't. Gerald specifically accused me of sabotage in my termination meeting. If I come back now and the audit fails, what do you think he'll do? He'll blame me and use my consulting involvement as proof I deliberately undermined the company. Robert's face fell. He knew I was right. However, I continued slowly. If Vanguard were to void my termination agreement, offer a formal apology, and reinstate me as Director of Regulatory Compliance with full authority over the audit process, then I'd be an employee doing my job, not a consultant who can be sued. Sarah, and given that Gerald fired me 1 week before a critical audit, publicly accused me of sabotage, and created this entire mess through his own negligence, I'd also want his resignation. Effective immediately. Robert stared at me. You're asking us to fire the COO. I'm asking you to fix a catastrophic management failure. Gerald created this situation. He ignored expert advice, undermined a perfectly functioning department, and terminated the one person who could navigate this audit. Now you're facing a $90 million disaster. I stood up. Those are my terms. You have until 5 p.m. to decide. I walked out before he could respond. At 4:47 p.m., Robert Chin called back. The board has accepted your terms. Gerald Hawkins has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full review. You're reinstated as Director of Regulatory Compliance, effective immediately, with full operational authority over the audit. Your salary is increased by 30%, and the board has drafted a formal apology letter. I closed my eyes. When is the audit? Tomorrow. 9 a.m. Then I'll be in the office in 1 hour. Have my team assembled in the main conference room. And Robert? I need access to everything, all documentation, all digital systems, all communications from the past 2 weeks. You'll have it. When I walked back into Vanguard at 6:15 p.m., the office was mostly empty. But in the main conference room, my team was waiting: Marcus, Jennifer, Tom, and Lisa. They looked like soldiers who'd been through a war. Lisa started crying the moment she saw me. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I tried to tell them I wasn't ready, but Gerald insisted stop. I said gently, this wasn't your fault. Gerald set you up to fail. Now, we have 15 hours to fix this. Can you work all night? Four faces nodded in unison. Then let's get started. Marcus, pull up the documentation matrix. Jennifer, I need the verification protocol status. Tom, financial systems review. Lisa, you're going to be my assistant. I need you to take detailed notes on everything we do tonight. For the next 12 hours, we worked with surgical precision. I'd built these systems over 12 years, and I knew every shortcut, every workaround, every backup plan. We reconstructed incomplete documentation. We verified data sources. We cross-referenced technical specifications with contract requirements. Around 2 a.m., Marcus found me in the archives, cross-checking physical files against digital records. How did you remember all this? He asked, exhausted but amazed. The backup systems, the alternate verification paths, the documentation hierarchies, I thought I understood, but you've got layers I never knew existed. 12 years, I said simply. I built redundancies upon redundancies because I knew one day something would break. I just didn't expect it to be management. By 7 a.m., we'd done everything possible. The documentation was complete. The systems were verified. The presentation materials were flawless. We'd worked miracles, but it was still going to be close. At 8:30 a.m., the DCA audit team arrived. 6 auditors, led by a stern woman named Patricia Hendricks, who'd been conducting Level 4 audits for 20 years. She had a reputation for being absolutely merciless. I met them in the lobby, professional and composed despite running on zero sleep and pure adrenaline. Ms. Hendricks, welcome to Vanguard Tech Solutions. I'm Sarah Mitchell, Director of Regulatory Compliance. We're ready for your review. She looked at me with the expression of someone who'd seen 1,000 companies claim to be ready and watched most of them fail. Let's get started. The audit was brutal. For 8 straight hours, Patricia Hendricks and her team dissected every aspect of our operation. They examined financial systems, personnel records, security protocols, technical specifications, supply chain documentation. They asked questions designed to trap and confuse. They cross-referenced answers against documents, looking for any inconsistency. I met every question with precise, documented answers. When they asked about subcontractor relationships, I produced complete verification files. When they questioned our security clearance procedures, I walked them through our protocol with supporting documentation. When they challenged our financial controls, I showed them our triple redundancy verification system. Around hour 5, Patricia pulled me aside. Ms. Mitchell, I've been conducting these audits for 2 decades. Your documentation framework is the most comprehensive I've encountered. How long have you been building this system? 12 years, I said. She nodded slowly. It shows. But then came the question I'd been dreading. One of her junior auditors found a discrepancy in the contract bid documentation, those same financial irregularities I'd discovered before my termination. Expenses that didn't quite match, dates that were slightly off, subcontractor relationships that weren't properly disclosed. Ms. Mitchell, Patricia said, her voice cold, these inconsistencies could indicate fraud in the bidding process. Can you explain them? The room went silent. My team looked terrified. This was it, the moment that could destroy everything. I took a breath and made a decision. Yes, I said calmly. I discovered those discrepancies 1 week before I was terminated. I documented them and reported them to our COO, Gerald Hawkins, and our CFO. I was fired 30 minutes later with Mr. Hawkins claiming I was manufacturing problems to sabotage the audit transition. Patricia's eyes narrowed. You were fired for reporting potential fraud? I was fired because Mr. Hawkins didn't want those discrepancies investigated. He wanted them buried. I pulled out a file I'd been carrying all day, my documentation of those irregularities, complete with timestamps showing when I'd reported them and when I'd been terminated. Everything is here, I said. The discrepancies, my report, the termination timeline. I believe Mr. Hawkins submitted falsified documentation in the original contract bid to make our proposal more competitive. When I discovered it, he eliminated the threat. Patricia took the file. She read through it in complete silence while everyone in the room held their breath. Finally, she looked up. MS. Mitchell, this is a serious allegation. I know. That's why I documented everything. She closed the file. We'll need to investigate this separately. However, I want to be clear. This appears to be an executive management failure, not a systemic compliance failure. Your documentation proves you identified the problem and attempted to address it through proper channels. The fact that you were terminated for doing so is troubling. She stood and addressed the room. We'll need to interview several executives as part of this investigation, including Mr. Gerald Hawkins. But based on what I've seen today, your operational compliance framework is sound. Exceptionally sound. 6 hours later, Patricia Hendricks delivered her preliminary findings to our board of directors. I wasn't in that meeting, but Robert Chin called me immediately afterward. Sarah, they passed us. Full approval on the Level 4 audit. Patricia Hendricks told the board your compliance framework is one of the best she's evaluated in her entire career. I closed my eyes and felt 12 years of work validated in a single moment. But there's more, Robert continued. The DCA is opening a formal investigation into Gerald's conduct. The falsified bid documentation, the retaliation termination, it's serious. Gerald has been terminated for cause. The CFO has been placed on administrative leave. And the board wants to meet with you. What for? They want to offer you the COO position. I didn't take the COO position. Not because I couldn't do it, but because I didn't want it. I was a compliance expert, not an operational executive. I loved the meticulous, tedious work of building systems that kept companies safe. But I did negotiate something better. I became Vice President of Regulatory Compliance with full department autonomy, a significant salary increase, and most importantly, explicit written authority that no executive could override my compliance decisions without board approval. Never again would some visionary COO be able to undermine systems that took years to build. I also insisted on one additional term. Lisa remained on my team as a senior analyst, with a clear understanding that she'd been set up to fail and had performed admirably under impossible circumstances. Gerald Hawkins faced criminal charges for fraud and retaliation. The investigation revealed he'd falsified multiple aspects of the contract bid to inflate Vanguard's competitiveness, then systematically eliminated anyone who might discover his deception. He eventually pleaded guilty to lesser charges and was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and permanent disqualification from government contracting. The $90 million contract proceeded successfully. Over the next 5 years, we maintained perfect compliance and won 2 additional contracts worth a combined $140 million. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months after the audit. I was presenting at a regulatory compliance conference in Washington, D.C., a speech about building resilient audit frameworks. After my presentation, Patricia Hendricks approached me. MS. Mitchell, I wanted to tell you something, she said. That audit was the most impressive compliance response I've encountered. You rebuilt a failing framework in less than 15 hours and produced documentation that many companies can't produce in 15 months. Thank you, I said. But what impressed me most wasn't the technical competence. It was the integrity. You could have let that company fail. You'd been wrongfully terminated, publicly humiliated, and blamed for problems you tried to prevent. Most people would have walked away and watched them burn. I thought about it, I admitted. But you didn't. You came back and saved them anyway. That's real professionalism. I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. Was it professionalism? Or was it something else? Here's what I eventually realized. I didn't save Vanguard Tech Solutions for Gerald Hawkins or the board or even the company itself. I saved it for my team, Marcus, Jennifer, Tom, and Lisa, who'd trusted me and built those systems alongside me for years. I saved it for the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on that contract. I saved it because the work mattered, even when the people in charge didn't. Gerald had thought he could replace institutional knowledge with fresh perspective. He'd thought systems built over 12 years could be dismantled and rebuilt in weeks. He'd thought the person who built those systems was disposable. He learned the hard way that some things can't be shortcut. Compliance isn't glamorous. It's tedious, meticulous, and often thankless. But it's also the invisible foundation that keeps everything standing. Remove it, and even the most impressive structure collapses. I still work at Vanguard. I still maintain those documentation systems and verification protocols that make people groan. I still get called the machine behind my back. And I still wear it as a badge of honor. Because the day they fired me before a $90 million audit, they learned something important. You can replace employees, but you can't replace the decades of expertise they carry with them. Sometimes the people you dismiss are the only ones who can save you. And sometimes, watching them realize that is its own form of justice. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's demonstrating exactly how valuable you always were and making them pay for the privilege of learning that lesson.